Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, friends. Good afternoon. Jai Bhim, Jai Pasmanda, Jai Mandal, Hul Johar, Satrangi Salam. Babsa Sivji is organizing online lecture series. In this series, we have invited eminent scholars, academicians, social activists from India and abroad who deliver lectures on different areas issue related with societies. In this series, today we are going to organize a lecture of Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhary, who is Associate Professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Choudhary is the author of Theatre Number Event, three studies on the relationship between sovereignty, power and truth, which was published in 2013. He is also author of Ambedkar and other immortals and untouched research program which was published in 2018. Professor Dr. Chaudhary is also his forthcoming book is new. It's come to distances, notes on Sebag and coronavirus association and isolation. On the behalf of Babsa Sivji, I would like to thank Dr. Soumyabrata Chaudhary sir who accepted our invitation and give his precious time uh, to speak. He will speak on topic. His today's topic is association, party and movement, some horizons for Phule-Ambedkar politics in the present. Now, on the behalf of Babsa Sivji, I would like to invite you, sir. Please enlighten us, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Uh, I'm very happy to speak to all of you. Thank you for the invitation. I'll speak for around 45 minutes. I want to speak about the notion of association in relation to political parties and historical movements and situate this discussion in the larger context of an Ambedkar Phule politics, both historically in the formation of such a politics from the end of the 19th century up to now, but also with specific reference to certain problems of our present experience. So, first, what is association? Uh, if you read Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, you will find a section in which he defines associations and he gives several examples of association. And you find that these associations are very common forms of political, economic, social organizations. So, for instance, he speaks of corporate entities, he speaks of political parties, he speaks of different social forms, he even speaks of things like bands of robbers and thieves, which are also examples of association. Associations then are any kinds of formal groups or any kinds of organizations that are formed between individuals with a specific aim or purpose in mind. These could also be called objective associations. Objective associations, in the sense, associations that exist objectively. So, a corporate firm or a political party is an objective association. It exists in the world as already identified and named. But in Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, there's also a whole section on something very closely related to this definition, but which is not exactly this definition itself. And that is when Ambedkar speaks of what he calls the emergence of associations who share a common feeling in specific contexts or in specific moments, uh, in which these common feelings cannot be at that very moment be objectified, or they cannot be expressed in the form of corporate identity. So the example that he takes is very interesting, and you must remember he's writing this in the first half of the 20th century, and he says that the modern nation, actually before being formed into a constituted formal nation, is something like an association which whose reality only exists in the common feeling that is shared within a particular set of people, groups, individuals, and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, there is also a kind of association which could be called a subjective association. So, broadly, we can distinguish between an objective association and a subjective association. But of course, you realize that a subjective association which emerges at a particular moment in history or within a particular situation eventually can become an objective association. So, for instance, in a situation where we encounter the feeling of a new nationality, a new national assertion, or even what Ambedkar calls a common feeling of being a nation, at a later point can, it doesn't have to, but can actually objectively be constituted as a new nation with a particular kind of government and a state form and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, between the subjective association and the objective association, there is always a kind of temporal or historical gap, a historical distance. And there's also within the distance the possibility of something that might happen or something that might not happen. So there is a kind of what you can call a certain undecidability in history between the moment or the site when a common feeling arises, which is an associational feeling, and the actual formation of an objective association in some later point in the future. So a nation might be formed out of a common feeling of nationality, or it might not be formed. And this has happened several times in history. That there have been, in several conjunctures, the assertion of a national feeling or even the demand based on a common national feeling, but eventually, historically, no new nation has been formed. But in certain cases, new nations have been formed. So there is an undecidability between the moment when a common associational feeling arises and when this associational feeling results or does not result in an objective association. Nation is only an example. It can be any other kind of objective association. But the question nevertheless remains unanswered or even unasked, that what lies at the basis of this emergence of a common feeling, of this common subjective association in history. So the answer to that broadly can be a movement. A movement is that particular force, that particular impulse that results in the formation of a common associational feeling. But of course, you can put it from the other side. You can say that a movement is nothing but the the emergence or the upsurge of common associational feeling. In that sense, a movement in its own duration, in its own unfolding, is a kind of subjective reality. But of course, you must be careful that here, subject, I do not intend to call subject any merely empirical individual. A subject is already a group. The subject is already a kind of form, but a form which has not become objectively formalized. So Ambedkar's point is that the only historical proof or reality or testimony to the existence of a subjective association is a common feeling, and hence it has to be always more than one individual because it has to be shared. A common feeling or an association is always a shared feeling. So it cannot be only an empirical individual. It must already be between at least one and another individual, or more than that. And yet, at the level of its historical emergence, at the site of its emergence, this particular unfolding remains subjective. So, hence, we are calling it a subjective association, of which the only uh, the only reality or the only real evidence, which is not an objective evidence, but a kind of subjective evidence, which Ambedkar calls common feeling, which can also be called intensity, or emotion, whatever, the same thing. Uh, so the example of nation is the very clear, vivid example in the 19th century to the 20th century. In general, Ambedkar has this theory of the modern nation that unlike the old nation, which, for instance, is the feudal nation, the nations which are formed on the basis of inheritance, on the basis of rights that were based on divine right in Europe, for instance, of who will be the king of a nation or the emperor, and so on and so forth. Based on a common feeling among the people, not something which is a pre-given history, a pre-given theory of inheritance, whether that be of birth or land or anything else, or wealth. So, this movement, if we take the example of the nation as a new movement, is also clearly a broadly a democratic theory of this subjective association. One of the examples of which is the nation that Ambedkar takes. So, when we speak of common feeling, we are already speaking not just of common feeling as an ordinary understanding of something that people share, two individuals share within a family, for instance. I mean, that is also an area of common feeling. But here, the meaning of common feeling is stronger. Here, the meaning of common feeling is that there is not only a common feeling, there's also, and this is very important, there's also the production of a general space of the common. Something which is, in the fundamental sense, a new community. A community which has still not been objectively formed or given a name or constituted as a law, but is already in a kind of nascent stage or as a potential. It is a space of the common. So the common feeling is not merely something felt as a transitory or as a passing feeling in the ordinary sense of emotion that all individuals feel, within any context. The family context is the most obvious one. But here, common feeling is actually the subjective constitution of a space of the common. So something like a common is a new kind of sharing, a new kind of arrangement, a new kind of distribution. So, of course, I mean, the concrete example that occurs to you when we speak of distribution is the distribution of, for instance, the resources of a society, the wealth of a society, which is thought of in terms of a new kind of common distribution, a common principle of distribution, a kind of economic egalitarianism, as an example. So you see, the main point here is, and this is what Ambedkar is pointing towards, that associations are always already there. All societies are made up of associations. So family is the most fundamental anthropological association. And in Indian society, surely one of the persistent associations over a long period of time is the association of caste, of jati, for which, of course, there is an ideology or a kind of doctrine, a kind of religious dogma, which is deep rooted in the texts of Hinduism, which gives you a theory of Varna, and a theory of Varna which produces an object. So, in that sense, an objective association already given to you in the text, in the law books or in the theological texts of in the history of Hinduism. And Ambedkar has shown that in several places. But when he's writing this text, or he's actually meant to speak this text, which he does not speak, as you know, Annihilation of Caste, in the early part of the 20th century, he's speaking of associations as both some immediate new associations that are being formed, but some associations which are extremely extremely deep rooted, and in that sense very rigid associations, very rigid forms, objective forms which do not refuse to go away, the prime example of which is caste. So this is what Ambedkar is saying on the one side, that there are always associations in society, but at the same time the main purpose of Ambedkar's speech, or the text and narration of caste, which is what? Which is, in Ambedkar's own words, the annihilation of the notion of caste. The notion of caste. So that very notion, or that notional system, which is deep rooted and made so rigid by the texts of Hinduism, by the social organization of Hinduism, and ideologically justified by the texts of Hinduism, to be broken, to be annihilated, must actually find that moment of change, that moment of radical change, which annihilation must be, in a new kind of association. So associations are already there, and something like an associational change must take place. An associational displacement must take place. A reconfiguration of associations must take place. And yet, it must take place in such a way that this fundamental structure, this rigid structure, must be broken, must be annihilated. A kind of new space must be formed, which could be called the space of equality or the space of the common. And simply spoken, a new community. But the important thing is, during the movement that forms this kind of a potential for a new community, there is no objective proof of such a new association. There is no reality outside the movement itself, which could be called that, look, this is the new subject of history. This is the new association that is now substituting or replacing the old inegalitarian, rigid, oppressive associations, which have institutional forms, of course, in society. So institutions and associations at that level are not different for Ambedkar. But this moment of change, and in that sense, Annihilation of Caste is the pioneering text of such a movement, is a movement which, in its unfolding, in its duration, its historical duration, takes place within a certain gap, within a certain distance between the pre existent objective associations and this new horizon. And that's why there's the word horizon is there in the title. And this new horizon of a future new objective community, a new constitution, actually. But in between, when this duration is unfolding, which is the duration of a movement, we are actually in a space where there is no objective constituted space yet. And that is the space of a movement. That is the space of something like historicity without history. If history is already a history of given identities, history of, for instance, history of education, which means history of institutions of education, whether that be the old Guru Shishya education or a new modern education. These are all institutions. A history of nations, where nations are already formed. So all histories, in the sense of being stable, archived, documented, temporal sequences, are already history of identities or subjects, in the sense of subject as identity. But when we speak of a movement, of course, there are also history of movement. So you can speak of the history of the national movement, the history of the anti-caste movement, when we come to that. But usually when we speak of the history of a movement, then we are already speaking from a certain retrospective moment, something where we have already passed the movement, and we have reached a certain point where we can we can cast a backward glance at that movement, and hence we speak of a history of a movement. But when Ambedkar is actually writing or creating this pioneering revolutionary text, Annihilation of Caste, he's not speaking in that sense from a historical point of view, from a retrospective, backward glance towards something in the past. On the contrary, he's actually making a discourse, or kind of, he's putting out a discourse into history, but going towards the future. But in going towards the future, he's also putting out something which has a historicity. And here, historicity simply means something which has a certain movement in history as it is unfolding. So the real challenge for someone who is both part of a movement and is also trying to understand that or grasp that movement or give that movement a certain kind of objective characterization is actually the challenge of giving a new name. So an identity cannot be ever made concrete without a new name. But the giving of that name, almost the gamble of the name, is itself not something that can come from a point which is a point of separation, from some kind of Archimedean point. You can't stand outside a movement and give a name. All names of movements are given during a movement. So, this is what I'm calling historicity as different from history. Historicity is within the duration of the movement, but while that duration is unfolding, there are also specific acts of generalization. So, name is a kind of generalization. So, that's why, for instance, Gandhi spoke of the social movement that he was trying to initiate as a movement for Harijans. What is Harijan? A name. But the moment you say Harijan, then you're not just speaking of a certain movement of reform or criticism of the caste system. You're already giving a subject identity to that movement. You're saying it is a movement on behalf of Harijans, which immediately creates a associational identity, the identity of the untouchable castes at that time as an identity of Harijans, to which, for instance, there is an opposition from an equally, if not more powerful, anti-caste position, which is the Ambedkarite position in that very period, where there is a critique of that name Harijan. I don't want to go into the details of that critique. We can take that up later. But the point is that this is all happening in the same period in history, which is the first part of the 20th century, before India's independence or before the transfer of power. Uh, and it is taking place with a certain kind of living historicity, a kind of living history. So historicity is nothing but living history. And history is nothing but that life of history come to a particular close. At least one sequence is closed. When we can speak of the history of that sequence. That's all. That's all that we are saying. So while this kind of a movement takes place, what is it that we find very concretely in the history of any movement? We find that this kind of a naming or this kind of a subject identity is often initiated, or the responsibility for this kind of a naming is often taken up by something that we identify as political party or party in general. So, a party is usually an intermediate stabilization of a movement that has a certain dynamic, unfolding in history. This is what has happened again and again in modern history. We see this happening for instance, in the Russian Revolution context, where the so-called Bolshevik party is not simply the party which initiates the revolution from beginning to end. Not at all. The movement itself has a dynamic, like I said, a living history. But what the Bolshevik party does is, at a certain point, between 1905 and 1917 broadly, it produces within the movement itself a point of stabilization. And in that sense, Bolshevik Revolution, or something like the Leninist party, becomes known not simply as an association of something which is unfolding, but becomes something like a vanguard party, the definition of a political party. Again, an example. We are not interested in Russian Revolution today, but it is just an example. The same kind of example can be found in the national movement with the Congress party. No one will ever claim that. Of course, people who are totally dogmatic followers of Congressism might say it, but no one seriously thinks that the entire, breadth and length of national movement is something which a Congress party has the signature, holds the signature of that movement. That would be absurd. But it is true that during that movement, at a certain point, Congress becomes the political party which is the certain kind of a intermediate stabilization. And that intermediate stabilization becomes more and more organized and consolidated, so that by the time India wins its independence or gets its independence, Congress becomes by and large identified with the movement itself. So this is a very interesting phenomenon with political parties, that while political parties are formed during a movement, in history, again and again, we have seen that they get consolidated to such an extent that these parties, they become, in a sense, the very identities of the movements themselves. Congress, in the case of the Indian national movement, and I mean, we took the example of Russia, the Bolshevik Party, and you can find so many examples from all over the world. Now, it is here, when once you've cleared the ground for this kind of a fundamental, connection of certain terms of association and party, that, of course, one thing needs to be clarified, that how does a political party usually do this? What are the instruments of a political party, apart from its own intra-organizational power, cadres, becoming a certain kind of official, semi-official, quasi-official voice of a movement. Congress became that, and other kinds of parties have become voices of a movement. Even though the movement had a multiplicity of positions, one party usually becomes the dominant voice of a movement. But there is another more powerful instrument of consolidation, and that usually takes place, and this is true of the Congress party, this is true of the Bolshevik party, and this is true of several other parties, that they also at some point become the custodians of state power. So what happens is a movement moves from its oppositional negative position of opposing some kind of a unit of power, like for instance the colonial state or the czarist state, the feudal state, and so on and so forth. And then at a certain point, if the movement is successful, there is a transfer of power, not simply formally and abstractly between one sovereign and another, like the king to the people or the British to the Indians. But concretely, this transfer of sovereignty becomes something which gets localized, which gets almost saturated by a particular objective association, a political party in this case. So that's why we think of the transfer of power from the British not only to the Indian people in reality, but to the Congress party, almost entirely to the Congress party, to the Bolshevik party in the case of the Russian Revolution. So when this happens, it is very clear that something like the state is a major kind of network and a ground on which to consolidate this kind of an objective association as a political party. So this is by and large the preliminary generalized sort of a framework of analysis within which we can quickly situate what is going on with a party of a very different kind, or a relationship between an association and a party of a very different kind, between not just Ambedkar, but going quickly a little, before Ambedkar, going a few steps before Ambedkar, and that is Phule. And what we find between Phule and Ambedkar by the end of the 19th, from the end of the 19th century to the beginning part of the 20th century, is that something which is a very, very specific sequence of social revolution and social association, in the specific sense that I explained, with Phule, enters into the 20th century almost without anyone's control over it, into a much larger network than Phule ever was involved in, and which is, of course, the network of something like nationalist politics. When Phule was making his own, and I have the Satyashodhak experiment in mind, when he was actually creating his experiment, that experiment was indeed a subjective association against the objective oppressive associations of caste, family, and there was also naming, as you know, of this of the Phule associational experiment. Satyashodhak is a specific, real, I mean, associational objective form because it was actually a Satyashodhak association. But there is a larger associational identity that he gambled, or he put his he put his signature on, no, and that is the identity called Shudra. For him, Shudra was actually an association, as different from only the most degraded and the most oppressed, minoritized part of the objective association of the Bhatta system. Phule turned it around, or tried to turn it around, with the gamble or a wager on a name, which is to say that Shudra is now a new possibility of a counter association, a subjective association. Because objectively, Shudra cannot be something you can recommend, clearly, from the point of view of an anti caste emancipatory position, clearly. But Phule did it. Why? How? Because in the historicity, in the living history of the movement, he did what I already explained is the function of that intermediate sort of a sequence, or the intermediate space, which is the space of the new name. And one of the new names that he put out is the name Shudra, which is not a new name, but a new meaning of the name, or a new effect of the name, a new signification of the name, if you want to put it a little technically. But yet, with Phule, you can't call it a political party. You can't really call it a party. You'll have to call it an associational in that dynamic sense, something which is part of living history, which is very, very specific to the movement that he is part of and he is kind of pioneering, both with reference to the Shudra subject, but also with reference to a sequence which is Shudra, Ati Shudra women, in which he and Savitri Phule are involved in. But it is still, by and large, not within the objective form of the political party, the objective association of the political party. So you could say that this is a kind of social politics, this is a kind of social association or a social movement, and yet in the doctrinal sense, that politics is always something like a politics of the party in the modern scenario of politics. You could say Phule's politics is not the part of the objective space of modern politics. It forms the threshold of modern politics, and yet it is not part of the objective party form of modern politics. Broadly, as a schema, not as a serious substantive proposition, because of course there is politics and very serious politics in Phule, but only as a schema. But this very thing in Ambedkar clearly changes, because of the fact that Ambedkar is plunged into a network of objective associations, which are primarily now not simply the associations of family and jatis, which is the case for Phule, but it is, apart from these associations of jatis and families and the village system and so on and so forth, but it is also primarily the association of political parties. And of course, a lot of the social associations and the family associations and the caste associations are reflected in the very names of political parties. So, in the middle 1930s, when Ambedkar forms the Independent Labour Party, and then a little after that, when he is moving into, trying to fight elections in the provincial councils, in the provincial legislatures, we have such parties as the Varnashram Party. We have parties which are openly objective associations based on caste, on absolutely partisan Hindu upper caste associations. And yet, we have new associational forms now being formed as political parties, which Ambedkar initiates between Independent Labour Party and, Scheduled Caste Federation, and fighting elections, which obviously is within the network of objective associations of political parties. At the same time, Ambedkar's, and this is, I can only speak about this elliptically and kind of as a conclusion, you'll have to take it like that. I have, worked on this for some time in the past. Uh, Ambedkar's main effort is to keep the cord, the thread, the historicity between the historical thread between the social association which has arisen out of the subjective conditions of this living history of change from Phule, at least from Phule, to this objective horizon of a new electoral system. And of course, we can't go into it, but the entire separation of electorates debate is part of this, a new electoral system, which is being translated into actual historical politics, which is electoral politics, party politics. But while he is entering that whole field, and he's doing that as an organizer, as a great organizer of the Scheduled Caste Federation and the Independent Labour Party as specific forms of objective associations that are political parties, he's also very careful to keep the thread, the living thread, alive, or the living thread, not without breaking the living thread between the conjuncture, the site of the emergence of the social association, which is subjective association through the movement. In simple words, a movement to be kept alive in the party. But you see, it's a very complicated situation at that time. Why? Historically, why? Because in the 1930s, Ambedkar has to both take his fundamental point of departure from the larger national movement, which is indeed a movement, which also has a certain, particularly through Gandhi, a certain social dimension. That movement, but also other kinds of movements which are equally powerful movements, but they are movements not only against the other objective association, which is the corporate, the colonial state, but which are objective associations in that early period, which are, for instance, objective associations of capitalism, the new corporations, the new forms of property, the new forms of private property. And against those things, the subjective associations that are being formed at that time among the workers. So Independent Labour Party becomes both a certain act of joining this new subjective association of workers, but at the same time providing a social critique of those very subjective associations. This is the complication of Independent Labour Party, which Ambedkar has to always very, very rigorously be vigilant about. He has to pursue that while taking his point of departure from the larger movement, both the national movement, but also and the social movement, but also the specific new movements in the context of not just India, but the global system of power, that is capitalist power. And as a critic of that capitalist power, to take up the new subjective energies and possibilities of the workers' movement, and yet within that movement produce a social critique of the workers' movement itself as a Brahmanical movement, or at least its objective expression in the new trade union movements or the new, socialist organizations as being still rooted in the objective associations of the Jati. This is Ambedkar's extremely difficult and yet extremely dynamic effort at that time. So even while he's fighting elections, he is trying to keep the double critique going, which is to produce a living history, which is also critique of another living history. You see, this is the complication. Because after all, workers' movements, national, these are all part of living history. These are not closed movements. These are not, at that moment, anything finished. They're all part of, something going on. And yet, while something is going on, he has to produce a critique of those very living histories through another, more hidden, more minoritarian, more marginal, more silent living history, which is the living history of caste. And in the case of the Independent Labour Party, he is doing it at the level of the workers' movement. So I'm not going into that history, but it is something, again, as an example of the complicated relationship between political party and association in history through movement that has to be kept in mind. And in that sense, the horizon for Ambedkar Phule politics during their own time is already set in this kind of a to and fro, this kind of a certain kind of uh, oscillation between the emergent social association, which is an association against the social oppressions that are being perpetrated by the objective associations of caste and so on, and at the same time, while this is going on, to be able to find a certain articulation, a certain relationship with the other new associational movements that are taking place in that period, and yet not falling into the trap, because there were always those traps, there was those temptations. And in a way, the separation of electorates was a movement to or a demand to actually make that separation very clear between the mainstream electoral consolidation of the national movement from the specific expression of the depressed classes or the depressed castes within the electoral system, but as a different subject identity. Ambedkar wanted to make that separation very clear. It didn't happen for reasons that we don't have to go into. Most of you know that. But the reason to make that separation clear was to actually make that objective association separate. But because it didn't happen, for Ambedkar, the challenge became even more serious till the end of his life, which was to somehow keep the subjective association alive, because Ambedkar was very clear that the subjective association of the anti-caste movement has not been successfully or fully translated into an objective, emancipatory, revolutionary organization of those very subjects who are the oppressed. That is, well, let me name the name now, that is a Dalit organization. Now, of course, we know that Ambedkar himself did not speak clearly of a Dalit organization. He spoke of different names or through different names. The Scheduled Caste Federation was one such name, the Republican Party was another such name, but most importantly, as an alternative objective association, not only as a political party, but something much larger, he spoke of Buddhism as the greatest horizon for him, and I call it an internationalist horizon, because after all, when Ambedkar, wrote Buddha and his Dhamma, and he gave his speech in Nepal, he was addressing a World Buddhist Congress. And he was speaking of Marx and Buddha as world figures, not just local figures of Europe and India. And yet he was speaking to an objective association, an internationalist association. So, again, this is a different topic, but as an example, to my mind, Ambedkar was speaking of a Buddhist international objective association against, or at least in competition with, another internationalism, which is the Bolshevik, the Leninist internationalism, the communist internationalism. So this is, and anyway, Ambedkar dies just about then. So this is by and large the historical horizon, or the horizon that living history, as well as the questions of consolidating that history through new hegemonic force, Congressism, and so on and so forth. These forces, they are trying, and by and large, in 1956, this process is suddenly interrupted by Ambedkar's death. So I have already taken a lot of time, but I'll just take 10 minutes more and finish, because we are coming now to the contemporary part. So I spoke of the name Dalit. The name Dalit is actually a resurrection, or a kind of re-intensification of the subjective association within independent Indian history in the 1970s. In its true sense. Now, one can make the case that Ambedkar spoke of broken people, Pada Dalit, Phule himself did it. I don't think that is very interesting to go into a kind of history of the name itself as a kind of pure linguistic question, or even a philological, etymological question with its attendant scholarship. That is not so interesting. I think it should be taken as a historical force, the force of the word Dalit, which is indeed post-Ambedkarite. Not post-Ambedkarite, post-Ambedkar. Ambedkarite and yet post-Ambedkar. And that force of the name Dalit clearly belongs to a sequence. And Vaibhav Abnave has taught me a lot about this, and you have heard him speak, I know, that it is a sequence or a force that definitely comes from somewhere in the end 60s, early 70s, probably around early 70s, when the Dalit pamphlets, the Dalit Panthers statements, their official kind of objective presentation of Dalit Panthers as an association, and yet not giving up on the excess of the subjective associational force. So that is also the point, that it's not simply a question of historical distance, that up to a certain point till 1960s the objective association does not exist, and then from 1970 something like Dalit Panthers comes into existence. No, even when a certain Dalit Panthers comes into existence as a formal objective association, a literary association, an artistic association, an intellectual association, even then there is a certain surplus, a certain excess of the subjective association over its own objective form. So in a way, this excess is also the mark that Ambedkar wanted to always, in a sense, preserve the living history, which is historicity over history itself, or the history of identities. So you find this kind of a very interesting, very complicated sequence or movement between end 60s and 1970. Gail Ombet has written enormously and wonderfully about this. And she has, of course, brought out many other connections between other associational influences, including that of Naxalbari. But it is something quite remarkable, and in a way it testifies to the rapid changes in the configurations of Indian electoral politics, that by, again, Gail Ombet has written about this, by the 1980s, we find that the electoral space of Indian politics is being now more or less objectively and clearly staked, or it is being clearly, laid, a claim is being laid to that space by a minority party, or a party based on a minoritarian identity, an objective minoritarian identity. And here also we see the change of the name of that minoritarian identity from Dalit to Bahujan. And this takes place in the 1980s, more or less, with Kanshiram and UP politics, where there is an open demand or a desire or even a strategy to enter the electoral space by and large as an explicit aim, as an explicit goal or end in mind, that this electoral space has to be now, if not completely, taken over, but it has to be sufficiently redistributed in favor of the minorities, in favor of. So the name Dalit is very much there by then. By 1980s, Dalit is definitely the most forceful name of minoritarian politics. But the interesting thing is that between Dalit Panthers in early 70s, where this minoritarian name, like I said, has a subjective excess over its objective form. In the case of Bahujan Samaj Party, we find by and large a kind of coming together, a kind of equivalence of the objective association whose aim is to objectively win political power, and the subjective intensity of the entire 100 years nearly of, from Phule to then, of the anti-caste movement. But by and large, the effort is, and it is a very serious effort, and one should take it seriously, that enough time has been spent the subjective duration, the subjective force. Now we need to translate that subjective force into objective numbers, which is the numbers reflected in elections, both legislative but also eventually national elections. But what is interesting, again, I can't go into it, but I mean, you will take notice of it, that it is exactly when this kind of equivalence, a kind of equation between the objective association and the subjective association is made through the Bahujan Samaj Party, that a new kind of subjective excess is now is now being culturally interpreted, not so much by the Dalits themselves, not so much by the subject which is Bahujan or Dalit, but by the larger, because you see, mainstream coming into mainstream of this kind of a party, Bahujan Samaj Party, has also made it a cultural association, a cultural form for mainstream institutions of thinking, of institutional discourse. And one of the places where this institutional discourse is reflected is the university. Is the university. Now, of course, Dalit Panthers had a very strong presence in the intellectual scenario, but it was by and large non-institutional or anti-institutional even. But it is with Bahujan Samaj Party that we see more and more students, Dalit students organizations come up with a strong, like in other kinds of, like the NSUI or like the, even the communist, I mean, SFI and so on and so forth, a very strong presence of the political organization reaching up to the lowest, not the lowest, but the widest dispersed level, including the level of students. So that thing we find, but also culturally, there is the figure of the leader, of the political leader. So from Kanshiram to Mayavati, we find a new kind of cultural interest being taken by mainstream cultural institutions, including that of the university. So you find now texts being produced by the 1990s, which are cultural texts of Mayavati seen as a symbolic figure. So when you read, modern writers on Dalit politics and Dalit history, uh, particularly upper caste writers, serious writers, but upper caste writers, then you will find that the word symbol is being used in association with Mayavati nearly by everyone. Nearly all upper caste writers use the word symbol or symbolical cultural iconization and so on. This cultural terminology or even artistic cultural terminology being used for Mayavati. Why is that? Because after all, Mayavati clearly is a political figure who at some point won with alliance and coalitions power and eventually by herself power and became the chief minister many times. But why is it that she is being read and written about in very interesting ways, no doubt, nevertheless, in the specific way of being a symbolical figure rather than a real political figure only? So a new kind of excess is being seen. What is an excess? An excess is something unconscious, something that I don't know, but yet I am, more than myself, or something other than myself. This is being done with Mayavati, as if Mayavati is someone other than herself. She's not just chief minister. She's not just the great, leader, a woman leader of the Dalit movement, but she's something other than that, merely those things. And hence, a lot of the new vocabulary that is being deployed or unleashed is the vocabulary of signs, symbols. She's a sign. Her handbag is a sign. Her clothes, her statues are a sign. And so this kind of a symbolical discourse, mainly initiated by upper caste writers, is a very interesting institutional symptom of now being unable to quite come to terms with the objective associational presence in mainstream politics of a Dalit party, of a Bahujan party, is being diverted into a kind of manipulated subjective excess. So this subjective excess is actually not simply the excess of emancipatory revolutionary politics. Subjective excess can also be manipulated towards the side of a certain kind of mysticism, a kind of academic mysticism, scholastic mysticism. And with Mayavati, this has been done up to now. It is being done with a great amount of scholarly resources, but also scholarly, I fear, a kind of scholarly discomfort with the coming of this kind of a forceful, quantitative, objective association of the Bahujan Samaj Party. Now, having cleared this ground, finally, when we come to the present, we find a very different kind of a scenario, as we clearly see. What we find is what Ambedkar would call the institutional and objective, eventually consolidate in the state the objective power of counter revolution, of something like Hindu counter revolution. Whether that Hindu is a traditional Hindu or it is a newfangled Hindu corporatization or manipulation of lots of other things, including a certain compact with modern kind of capitalism in the way that it is being mediated through a lot of colonial, post-colonial structures and so on and so forth. That is a complicated, but I think a very serious discussion. But I'm just placing it before you, whatever that might be. But basically, a counter-revolution which has a very strong resurrection again of the name Hindu. Because you could say, and I have written about it, that Congress is also kind of Hindu Congressism, but a crypto Hindu, where the name, what is crypt? Crypt is to put the name in a burial, to bury the name, to keep the phenomenon, but bury the name. Which the present counter-revolutionary sequence, what we find is the opposite, is to make the name an excess over sometimes even its effects, where the name Hindu is more and more present in your face, even when a lot of what the name indicates could go against even the consistent orthodoxy of what is it to be a proper Hindu militant. So that's why I again can only indicate this. It is not clear, or it is not necessary, that the RSS, long history of RSS, and the short history of BJP, relatively short history of BJP, and the even shorter history of the Modi Amit Shah oligarchy is consistent with each other. Totally. I mean, it is of course partly consistent, but not entirely, probably. And yet we find that a counter-revolutionary upsurge of the name, which is Hindu today. So in the light of that, quickly to conclude, what are the figures that we can see in contention with, or in a kind of complicity with, in a kind of agreement with this name Hindu in today's scenario? From the side of subjective association, from the side of the objective party, and finally, the question of the historical movement. So here, let's take the example very quickly of what is going on in Delhi at present and finish with that. Not just in Delhi, but on the borders of Delhi, which is the farmers' movement. Now, very recently, a couple of days back, I had a very intense and a kind of contestatory discussion with a student. And part of what I'm saying is I owes itself to that discussion. So one of the things that you will agree with, by and large, with the farmers' movement is that it comes out of something that is an actual historical moment, which is not part of the long history of any party or any organization or association as such, which are the laws, which are economistic laws, which affect directly the present, complicated, unequal, nevertheless, the larger landscape or configuration of the farming system and the farmers' lives. So this is the first point, the laws that have come onto the scene. The second point is that the movement that has come in opposition to these laws is also something which can be traced back to the cause itself, which are the laws, which means, and that was the contestation and the discussion with my student, that who are opposing these laws? So the answer to that would be those who are affected by it, not in the general sense merely, but in the specific sense. Those whose economic lives are directly affected by these laws, such that not only will they lose economically, but they will also lose politically. They will lose socially. They will lose their dominance. So a critique is possible, and a very serious critique, that within the complicated, unequal configuration of farmers in general in India, The Punjab Haryana farmers are leading the movement because not only will they be economically affected by these laws in the main, but also their position in the sense of being the dominant objective association within the farmers' configuration would be affected. So, this is a kind of serious critique of the movement from within the movement itself. And yet, the fact is, and this was the second point in my discussion with my student, the fact is that people who are speaking of, so who are the ones who are speaking of the marginal farmer? Who are the ones who are speaking of the Khet Mazdoor, the one who is a kind of farming proletariat? Interestingly, it is the state, it is BJP. They are saying that what we have done is actually for the benefit of the small farmer, the marginal farmer. But the fact is that within the farming movement itself, there is a strong perspective within the movement itself, which is a perspective of the small farmer, which knows that the small farmer is within the farming community itself a marginalized class vis-a-vis the big farmer. And of course, this movement in terms of the sheer scale is only possible because of the big, well-off, consolidated, powerful farmers, with all the skepticism that you must, put into the word powerful. And yet the small farmer is also part of this movement to the extent that the small farmer is someone who would be affected by the large farmers' own deprivation, because it would be passed on, the burden would be passed on to the small farmer. And second, because in general, the small farmers' intrinsic welfare, and that is the ideological point, intrinsic welfare would not be in any way served by a law which is a law of the open market. Or open market is a mythology, there is no open market, but the law of a market society. Let's put it in terms of what the great, uh, the historian of economics, Karl Polanyi, called it market society. Market society is not going to serve, ideologically, it's very clear. Market society, the objective association of the market society is not going to serve the small farmer. So, in principle, subjectively, without any comfort within the objective reality of Indian farming, where the Punjab, Haryana large farmers dominate, for the small farmer across the country, the farming proletariat, in a way, it is not comforted at all. Yet it is, in principle, opposed to market society as an objective principle or a principle of an objective association. Having said that's the final point. But is it that the small farmer is simply someone who is waiting for a future when this movement would, in some unforeseen future, eventually become truly egalitarian in a kind of large vanguard revolution that the farmers would carry out in society? Of course not. Like any movement, like Ambedkar taught us, that within the movement, there has to be a critique of the movement itself. From within the social associational dynamics of the movement itself. And that social could also include, in an economistic situation like the farming question, the economistic reflection of society. And this is something which my student informed me of, and that is, I think, a very important point, which is that a section of the Dalit farmers, and of course I can't document this because this needs to be documented, but nevertheless, let me kind of report it to you because I think it's quite believable. A section of the Dalit farmers are asking for, within the movement, a voice for the specificity of these farmers, both as farmers and as Dalits. And the third point is that as Dalits and as farmers, the place where they are most affected by, because Dalit farmers are obviously the smallest farmers, the ones who are the most proletarized in the situation, they're asking for an opposition not only to the farming laws, but to another set of laws which were equally but very smoothly passed by this counter-revolutionary BJP government. And those are the labor laws. The labor laws. So, interestingly, in the mainstream society, among the middle classes, upper caste middle classes, the farmers evoke a certain kind of organic power, of seeing the sheer organic strength of the farmers who bring the whole community, from the people to elders, the food, the langars, the animals. I heard a farmer say, "We'll bring our cattle, we'll bring our bullocks, we'll put every our village in front of you. And now you tell us, where will you go?" It is that kind of power, organic power, that they bring. And yet, within that organic power, there is discrimination, there is distinction, hierarchy of the large farmer, and in Punjab, particularly, the great surge of Dalit small farmers who are affected not just by this farming. In fact, they are not affected directly by the farming laws because, like my student told me, they are not affected by the MSP. They don't get MSP all over the country. Who gets MSP? The support price. But they are affected by the labor laws. And in principle, the labor laws stand for a certain kind of shift of paradigm among those very people who are so impressed with the organic power of the farmers. The labor laws are seen as obstructive to capitalist modernization. And the word reform, while in the case of the farming law, is seen still with a lot of suspicion that this reform is an agenda of BJP and so on and so forth. And there, the Adani Ambani rhetoric is very sort of even seen as a real kind of a threat from these global oligarchies. But when it comes to the labor laws, where Adani Ambani is a real, it is in your face. It is in your face because ultimately the larger generic term is labor. There is a certain cultural co-option, or even giving up on labor as any kind of a subject of association or living associations or living history in our times. So it is the Dalit farmer in Punjab who is possibly asking for a particular form of association to be both objectively and subjectively recognized and fight for that objective and subjective association, which in this case is labor, but not just labor in the sense of industrial labor, but labor in the larger generic sense of all living activity through which we both make our lives, produce our lives, but also in producing our lives, we also want to produce our world. In that sense, Marx used to say, a world to win and nothing to lose. But that is not what the farmers are really saying at all, in terms of the larger universal demand of politics, apparently. And yet, that universal voice, even if a minoritarian or a marginal voice, a Dalit voice, is there even as we speak. Of course, the state would immediately want to name it, counter name it by calling it Maoist, calling it something else, anti-national, so on. That is obvious as a battle of names. But my last point is, and that's my conclusion, that this question of the name or the wager of the name as something which signifies the excess of living history over merely something which is a closed historical sequence, or the excess of subjective association over an objective associational form. This name is a name which can always change. So it is not something we should hold on to as like a fetish, whether it be Dalit, Bahujan, or any other kind of name. Proletariat, doesn't matter. So that's why, a lot of discussion happens. Should we keep Bahujan? Should we say Bahujan? Should we say Dalit? All that discussion is important in specific contexts. But in a universal perspective or as a horizon, the point is, even if we say Bahujan and not Dalit, even that name will change tomorrow, you see. It is bound to. So that itself cannot be the stake. This is what counter-revolutionary does. And in that sense, we must resist the temptation of counter-revolution. What counter-revolution does is, first of all, use the name as a subjective force, call it sentiment, So BJP will say Hindu sentiment is being hurt. Hindu sentiment is the reason. So which is subjective, more and more subjective access. Cow is a question of Hindu sentiment. Love jihad is a question of Hindu sentiment. Everything is a question of Hindu sentiment. You would think there is only subjective access. Hence, you would think that there is nothing but something like a subjective blindness, madness. But at that very moment, the counter revolutionary voice will say, or that kind of an institution, that party, that objective association will say that name is something which is purely objective. That name is not just a name, it is a thing. The Hindu is there. Hindu is a reality. Forever it has been there. So it is not a name, it is not subjective. It is hyper objective, totally objective. In that sense, it is indeed fascist. So name can indeed enter into a fascist trap or a fascist sort of a black hole. So it is between this kind of a subjective excess that is beyond the objective name, and also to resist the objectivization of the subjective name as something which is like a fascist black hole, that I think in the present times we have to again work like Ambedkar Phule did in their times as a horizon for a certain kind of distance between the subjective association and the objective association, and not be afraid of not having name of the subjective association and the identity of the objective association always always not coming together. We should not be afraid of non-identity, even as the question of identity becomes more and more important in our times. That much. Thank you for your attention. So I'd really like to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Yeah, yeah,
Sir, can you hear me?
yeah. I can kind of hear you. Very, very,
Very
yeah,
slow.
yeah. Very slow, but yeah. Now it's a little better. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for your thought-provoking lecture. And
Thank you.
in very good way, you spoke about association, objective association and subjective association, how these association are distinguished, and from Phule Ambedkar to present, and what kind of there is differences and what kind of relevance for present scenario as well. Sir, we have some question.
Yeah, yeah. Of course.
In this process, sir, we have first question from Havaldar Bharti.
Right.
Can you read, sir?
No, I'm afraid I can't read.
Okay, okay,
I'm
sir.
with
I
my
will read.
eyes. Wait, yeah. I have someone with me who can read it out to me. Yeah,
No, sir, no problem. I can read you, sir.
you can
I
read
can
it
read.
out. So yeah, please do
Yes,
that.
sir.
Yeah.
Sir, Havaldar Bharti asks, can iconography or construction of symbolic movement by Mayawati consider as source of history writing? Meant was it preservation of anti-caste history?
Just this last part. What is that last part? Uh,
Uh,
I cannot. Just repeat that question, please. Yeah.
Sorry, sir. Can iconography or construction of symbolic movement by Mayawati consider a source of history writing? Meant was it preservation of anti-caste history?
All right. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah. So the one of the factual answers to that is, it seems to me that much of the energy, the scholarly energy that has uh, entered into, gone into the the construction of Mayavati as a figuration, as an iconographic construction, as a semiotic phenomenon, has come from a certain kind of a post-colonial preoccupation with society seen as complex, intertwined, entangled cultural systems, And caste is seen also in terms of the interaction and the contestations within cultural systems with effects of power, of course, which is taken from Gramsci and so on, something like which is political power, but political power in the social sense. Uh, and in that light, Mayavati becomes a very interesting figure or figuration to conduct your analysis. So that has happened, but uh, you see, the question is that anti-caste history uh, will have two dimensions. I think the first dimension is the dimension of the material historical analysis and documentation of what I have called the associational intervention and challenge to dominant objective associations. And of course, that is also a cultural intervention. But in the first place, it should not be culturalized. In fact, it should be the other way around. That all cultural, and this is something Ambedkar wrote about in Annihilation of Caste, when he said that the cultural forms of society reproduce themselves through certain subjective, repetitive structures of feeling, which are played out and lived out, for instance, during the cultural festivals, the religious festivals, the Hindu calendar, as it were, over a year, the pujas, the Ganesh puja, Durga puja, and so on and so forth. And the common feeling that comes with a new movement, the common feeling which comes with a new life of the association, is actually a certain interruption, a certain distance between the cultural object, that is community, that is religion, that is family, caste, and so on, and this kind of a new subjective movement, which is a movement being created not by intracultural resources, but something that is challenged. That is challenged. So the temple entry movement in the 1920s and 30s is a challenge to a certain repetitive exclusion that takes place in segregated spaces in religion. In itself, it is not a religious movement. It is wrong. I mean, of course, for reasons of schematization, you can call it a religious movement. But in its real force, clearly, it is a movement which is taking place from the outside. It is a proto Dalit movement which is taking place from the outside, in not in the temple space, but it is already taking place in the space outside, which is wanting to enter the temple. It is not by entering the temple that you become an association. It is because you're already subjectively an association that you want to enter the temple. You see? And this is not a cultural, in the first place, this is not a cultural intervention. It is a political, well, it is a, I'll use the word living intervention. It is a kind of living history. And if politics is the closest name that comes closest to this kind of living history, then it is political. But of course, the second part of this answer is also important, that when a movement takes place, then it does also appropriate and sort of redirect the cultural resources of society and the cultural symbols of society in a new direction, or with a kind of new energy, no doubt about it. And Mayavati, the statues that she has, in a sense, uh, you know, s- uh, you know, been built around her, or she herself has initiated, have a kind of provocation for, which is a cultural provocation, no doubt. But that is interesting. Why? Because I've heard, people like even Ashish Nandi say things like that this excess, this obvious excess of the statue, of the sheer physical, plastic excess over social utility of a statue, is isn't it a kind of waste of Dalit politics? Isn't it a waste? Wouldn't Dalit politics be better served by, for instance, something more utilitarian, like I don't know what, but I remember a long time back this example. Somewhere I heard someone, I think Nandi himself, speak in an interview, but I could be wrong. But something like a hospital, something like hospital. Now you see, this is another kind of recuperating the logic of a certain kind of material priority of, or priority of material life over culture as a new ideology. So it is exactly when the materiality of a political intervention has gone to the extent that the BSP and Mayawati have tried to put a certain kind of symbolic excess out there in the public space and made it a challenge to the sphere of visibility, the kind of distribution of visibility, which is an upper caste distribution mostly. It is exactly then the upper caste comes back and says that, politics should be utilitarian, politics should be economistic. And yet, it is in the cultural institutions of the upper caste that the first culturalization of Dalit politics took place. And Mayavati clearly is an example of that. So yeah, I think it's an interesting, situation there.
Thank you so much, sir, for your response. Uh, on the behalf of Babsa Sivji, I would like to thank Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhary,
No
sir.
more questions, Pradhani? No more
No, sir,
questions?
there is not
That's
any
all.
question, sir.
All right.
Okay,
Okay. All right.
okay, sir. Okay, sir. Yes, sir, you gave your precious time to us from your busy schedule, and we are very grateful to you, sir. And thank you so much on the behalf of Babsa Sivji. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.